All right, so um, we wanted to dive into something that's pretty exciting for us here in Cape Breton.
Okay.
Jaime Battiste, one of our own,
Yeah.
is considering a run for the Liberal leadership.
Interesting.
It's already shaping up to be a fascinating race.
I can imagine.
You've got big names like Anita Annan
Right.
and Steve McKinnon stepping back.
Yeah.
And then you've got others like Christy Clark and Mark Carney
Mm.
potentially jumping in.
Yeah, it's definitely a dynamic situation.
Yeah,
And Bautiste's potential candidacy adds like another layer of intrigue.
for sure.
The possibility of having the first Indigenous person
Yeah,
strive for the Prime Minister's
they're
office,
huge.
it is significant.
And for us, the fact that he's from Cape Breton
Yeah.
makes it even more interesting.
Absolutely.
We've been following his career, and now he's aiming for the top job.
Wow.
But there's one thing in his platform that's got us scratching our heads.
Okay.
His stance on the carbon tax.
Yes.
Let's
Carbon
talk
tax is a hot button issue,
It is.
especially in Atlantic Canada.
For sure.
It's interesting how Battiste is approaching it, considering the potential impact on our region
Mm-hmm.
and his own unique perspective as an Indigenous leader.
Right off the bat, he acknowledges the steep $350,000 entry fee for the leadership race.
Gosh, that's a significant barrier for anyone.
Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Such a high fee can definitely limit the field,
Right.
potentially excluding candidates who don't have significant personal wealth
Wow.
or access to a network of wealthy donors.
Yeah.
It raises questions about fairness and accessibility
For
within
sure.
the political process.
And it makes you wonder how someone like Battiste,
Yeah.
who's relying heavily on Indigenous leaders
Right.
and emphasizing his Atlantic Canadian roots for fundraising,
Mhm.
will navigate that financial hurdle.
It highlights the influence of regional interests
Yeah.
in a national leadership race.
For sure.
Historically, the Liberal Party has been shaped by regional representation. Think about the role Quebec has often played.
Right.
Battiste's focus on Atlantic Canada and Indigenous communities
Mm-hmm.
adds a distinct dynamic,
Yeah.
particularly given his stance on issues like the carbon tax.
Speaking of representation, Battiste draws parallels with figures like Elijah Harper
Oh, okay.
and Jesse Jackson,
Yeah.
emphasizing the importance of breaking barriers.
Mm,
It's powerful imagery,
it is.
evoking the historical struggles for inclusion.
It's certainly symbolic. Having an Indigenous Prime Minister
Right.
would send a strong message about reconciliation and representation.
Absolutely.
But it's essential to remember that symbolism is only one part of the equation.
Right.
The real impact would depend on the specific policies and actions
Yeah.
taken by the government.
Okay, so let's unpack Battiste's policy platform.
Yeah.
He's expressed support for continuing many of the Liberal initiatives already in place.
Yep.
Things like the food program,
Hmm?
dental care, and pharmacare.
Okay.
These all align with the party's broader social safety net goals.
He seems to be positioning himself as a continuation of the current Liberal platform in many ways,
Right.
appealing to the existing base.
Yeah.
However, as we mentioned, his position on the carbon tax is where things get a bit more nuanced.
Okay, so before we jump into that,
Sure.
maybe you can give us a quick overview of the carbon tax.
Okay.
How does it work, and why is it causing so much debate, especially here in Atlantic Canada?
The carbon tax is essentially a fee on fossil fuels,
Okay.
designed to make it more expensive to pollute.
Right.
The idea is to encourage businesses and individuals to reduce their carbon footprint
Hmm.
and transition to cleaner energy sources.
Okay.
The controversy arises from the fact that it increases costs for consumers,
Yeah.
especially those who rely heavily on fossil fuels,
Yeah.
like many in Atlantic Canada,
Right.
where we rely on oil for heating and transportation.
Exactly. And that's the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
Battiste, while being environmentally conscious,
Mm.
is suggesting a temporary pause on the carbon tax and wants a First Minister's meeting to reevaluate it.
It's a tricky balancing act.
It is.
On one hand, there's the urgency of addressing climate change,
Right.
which he acknowledges,
Yeah.
citing the UN's warnings about the impact on things like fisheries.
Right. A major concern for us in Cape Breton.
Absolutely.
He also talks about his concerns for his son's future,
Okay.
which adds a personal dimension to the issue.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there are those economic worries about the carbon tax,
Yeah.
particularly in regions like ours.
And that raises a crucial question.
Okay.
Can you effectively address climate change while hitting the pause button
Yeah.
on a key policy like the carbon tax?
Right.
And can you find a solution that works for everyone, considering the different interests at play?
Battiste seems to think so.
Okay.
He's proposing this First Ministers meeting as a way to find that common ground.
Right.
But is that a realistic goal?
It's a good question.
Can you really get all the provinces with their varying priorities and economic realities
Yeah.
to agree on a path forward?
That's what we'll be exploring next.
That is the question.
It's a tall order, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The provinces have very different perspectives on the carbon tax,
Right.
and their economies are structured in different ways. What works for Ontario or Quebec
Right.
might not work for Nova Scotia or Newfoundland and Labrador.
And that's what makes Battiste's position so intriguing, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to bridge that divide to find a solution that addresses both the environmental concerns and the economic realities of a region like ours.
Absolutely.
It's a tightrope walk, but one that many in Cape Breton are watching closely.
Absolutely. He's walking a fine line, trying to appeal to both those who are pushing for urgent climate action and those who are worried about the immediate impact on their wallets.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, there's also the question of Indigenous rights and how they intersect with the carbon tax debate.
You're right. That's a crucial aspect that we haven't touched on yet.
Yeah.
As an Indigenous leader, Battiste brings a unique perspective to this discussion.
For sure.
Does his platform address how the carbon tax impacts Indigenous communities specifically?
It's interesting because while his platform calls for a reevaluation of the carbon tax,
Right.
it doesn't delve deeply into the specific concerns of Indigenous communities.
Okay.
This raises an important question for you to consider.
Right.
How might Battiste's own experiences and the perspectives of Indigenous communities shape his approach to this issue if he becomes Prime Minister?
That's a really good point. We're both from Cape Breton, and we know that many Indigenous communities here rely on traditional practices
Yeah.
like fishing and hunting,
Right.
which could be impacted by climate change.
For sure.
How would Battiste balance those traditional ways of life with the need to transition to a more sustainable future?
It's a complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
But it's something that Battiste will need to address head-on if he wants to gain the support of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous voters. He'll need to show that he understands the unique challenges faced by Indigenous communities and that he's committed to finding solutions that work for everyone.
And that brings us back to this whole idea of representation.
Yeah.
It's not just about having an Indigenous person in the Prime Minister's office.
Right.
It's about having someone who will truly represent the diverse voices and perspectives of all Canadians.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that those who have been historically marginalized have a seat at the table and that their voices are heard in the decision-making process.
Right.
Battiste's potential candidacy represents a step towards that.
Yeah.
But it's just the beginning of a much larger conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about the financial hurdles, the importance of representation, Battiste's policy platform, and that tricky carbon tax dilemma.
Right.
What stands out to you as the most significant aspect of his potential candidacy, especially for us here in Cape Breton?
For me, it's the potential for a shift in perspective.
Okay.
Battiste brings a unique lens to the leadership race, one shaped by his Indigenous heritage, his Atlantic Canadian roots, and his commitment to finding common ground.
It's like he's bringing a whole new set of voices to the table.
Yes.
Voices that haven't always been heard in Ottawa as Cape Bretoners.
Absolutely.
It's something we can be proud of.
Precisely. And that's something worth paying attention to, regardless of your political leanings.
Right.
This race could be a catalyst for a more inclusive and nuanced conversation about the challenges facing Canada.
I think that's a really important point. It's not just about Battiste as an individual.
Yeah.
It's about the potential for change he represents.
And the possibility for a more collaborative approach to policymaking, one that takes into account the diverse perspectives and needs of all Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
Speaking of diverse perspectives, let's circle back to the carbon tax for a moment.
Okay.
It's clearly a complex issue with strong opinions on both sides.
Yeah.
How do we move beyond the rhetoric and have a productive conversation about finding solutions that work for everyone?
It's important to remember that the carbon tax isn't just about reducing emissions.
Okay.
It's also about generating revenue that can be invested in clean energy solutions and programs to support those most affected by the transition.
So it's about finding a way to balance the short-term costs with the long-term benefits.
Exactly.
And making sure that those who are most vulnerable aren't left behind in the process.
Exactly. And that's where the real debate lies.
Okay.
How do you ensure a just and equitable transition to a low-carbon economy?
Right.
How do you support those communities and industries that will be most impacted by the shift away from fossil fuels?
It's a conversation that needs to happen.
Yeah,
And Battiste's proposal for a First Ministers meeting could be a step in that direction.
for sure.
Whether or not it will lead to any concrete solutions remains to be seen, but it's certainly generating a lot of discussion.
It's worth noting that the Supreme Court has already upheld the constitutionality of the federal carbon pricing scheme, so it's unlikely to disappear entirely. But there's always room for dialogue and adjustments to ensure it's being implemented in a way that's fair and effective for all Canadians.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got a potential candidate who is breaking barriers, bringing a fresh perspective, and sparking important conversations about the future of Canada.
Yeah.
He's also grappling with some thorny policy issues like the carbon tax that will require some creative solutions.
Absolutely.
It really feels like we're at a crossroads in Canadian politics,
Yes.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's this sense of urgency around issues like climate change and reconciliation, and people are looking for leaders who can offer bold solutions and bring everyone together.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, Battist's candidacy reflects a broader trend towards more diverse and representative leadership.
Yeah.
And it's not just about ticking boxes. It's about bringing different lived experiences and perspectives to the decision-making table.
And that has to be a positive step, right? The more perspectives we have, the better equipped we are to tackle these complex challenges that we're facing as a country.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that there isn't one right answer.
Right.
And that the best solutions often come from listening to and learning from those who have been traditionally excluded from positions of power.
So what does this all mean for you listening in?
Yeah.
Why should you care about Haime Battiste and the Liberal leadership race?
Well, for one thing, it's a chance to witness history in the making.
Right.
We could potentially see the first Indigenous Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, that's huge.
But beyond that, it's an opportunity to engage with the key issues facing our country.
Okay.
Climate change reconciliation, economic inequality, and to think critically about the kind of leadership we want to see in the future.
It's a reminder that politics isn't just something happening in Ottawa.
Yeah,
It affects all of us right here in Cape Breton and across the country.
for sure.
Our choices matter, and our voices deserve to be heard.
This deep dive has only scratched the surface of this complex and evolving story.
Right.
It's important to stay informed, to engage in thoughtful discussions,
Yeah.
and to consider the long-term implications of the choices we make as a nation.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for our final thought for you to ponder as you continue following this race.
Here's something to consider. If Haime Battiste becomes Prime Minister,
Okay.
how might his experiences as an Indigenous leader from Cape Breton shape his approach to navigating complex issues like the carbon tax and balancing environmental concerns with economic realities?
Right.
Could this lead to a more collaborative and inclusive approach to policymaking in Canada?
That's a great question.
It is something to think about.
It really gets you thinking about the potential for change and the power of representation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive,
Thanks for listening.
and we hope you found it informative and engaging. Keep those questions coming and stay curious.